Hello everybody, welcome to the Boxing Science Podcast. This is another Q&A episode where I'm answering your questions about a range of different subjects of sports science in boxing. I'm going to be covering the 3 biggest mistakes in professional boxing. I'm going to be talking about how to program effectively, how to integrate red zone conditioning sessions, sprint training sessions into a training week. I'm going to be discussing the biggest bang for your buck exercises in terms of strength training for the punch, but also talking about effective exercises to perform in your boxing sessions. And we're also going to be talking about how to prevent lead shoulder fatigue, which a lot of boxers do struggle with. So the first question is, what are the 3 biggest mistakes made in professional boxing? In a previous Boxing Science Podcast episode, I discussed the biggest mistakes made in amateur boxing. Now there is some similarities in terms of the mistakes made and kind of the training methods that are utilized. In this question, I'm going to answer the 3 kind of trends that I see within professional boxing. The main things are not necessarily around training exercises or going on long road runs or anything like that. It's more around about training camp management. What they're doing right at the very start of training camp, during their training camp, and right at the very end, just before they fight. So let's start at the beginning, more or less after a fight. A boxer has too long off. I think that they need a rest because obviously it's a physically demanding sport. It depends how much punishment that you take in the fight, how tough that fight's been, how tough the training camp has been, and how long you have off after a fight. Now, I do think that a boxer should have 1 or 2 weeks off before they start training again. I've seen professional boxers 3, 4, maybe even 5 weeks off, especially going into the boxing training. Probably pick up the boxing training first, likely to have 5 to 6 weeks off their strength and conditioning. When you look at professional sports, let's look at the biggest sport in the UK, which is football. Professional footballers right at the very top level don't have any weeks off. They might go on holiday, but they take their performance coach or something like that with them where they're doing some sort of workout, because the drop off in training load is that much. When they go back into training, they're more susceptible to injury. And this comes into point 2, where I'm going to be talking about spikes in training load. With a professional boxer compared to professional footballer literally doesn't have any time off. Obviously, time off from competing, but in terms of training, they're on it all the time to make sure that they're keeping them training loads just topped up to a level to try and prevent any reduction in fitness, in strength, in speed, that reduction in training load to make sure that they're not going into training and being susceptible to injuries. Professional boxing, I'd say a week or 2 weeks off after a fight, start to build up training load very steadily, start implementing strength conditioning, the conditioning quite early on to try and build up them physical qualities, start reducing that body mass to make sure that you have the best possible training camp. So the second biggest mistake links into the first one is training load management within your training camp. What we're talking about there is not having too much time off because you're not wanting to have spikes in your training load. This is really important for the start of training camp, where I see a lot of professional boxers do too much too soon. They're thinking that I've only got 10 or 12 weeks. Some people even have less time, maybe 6 or 8 weeks to prepare for the next fight. They feel like they need to get into more intense training camp straight away. 9 times out of 10, they're often a lot heavier than when they last train. So this is going to have a bigger impact on their joints, on their muscles. The combination between increased body mass and lack of fitness and also spikes in training load are going to increase that likelihood of injury. So that's at the start of training camp, but training load management is also quite poor in the middle or towards the end of training camp, where they've probably seen spikes in training load. I've known boxers do no sparring 1 week, and then the next week they start the sparring and they're sparring 2 or 3 times a week. This is a massive spike in training load, and that can contribute to the likelihood of injury, but also can contribute to overreaching, fatigued, feeling flat, and potentially increasing the likeliness of illness. With the training load management, it's just having a plan, progressing steadily. So instead of just going from no sparring to full sparring, what are you doing in that period there to prepare for your intense sparring periods? Build it up in terms of technique sparring, body sparring, maybe just doing 1 sparring session a week and then building it up to 2 sessions to 3 sessions week by week. So you've got a plan in the amount of rounds that you're actually completing over training camp, and then being able to taper that off effectively for fight night. That's the second biggest mistake. It's just training load management at the start of training camp, but also in the middle of training camp when you start increasing them sparring rounds. So the third biggest mistake is the weight cuts. Do a full podcast on this in terms of like the standards that need to be put in place to check an athlete's hydration level, how much they're cutting towards last weight cut, what percentages that they need to be hitting from 5 weeks out to 3 weeks out, all the way through to fight week. The main concern is that people trying to cram themselves down into a weight category that's not necessarily suited for them, and trying to be a little bit clever in terms of like acute weight loss strategies, extreme dehydration strategies as well. Really, when you look at boxing at the moment, we've got some really successful boxers such as Canelo, Lomachenko, got Gervonta Davis as well, that aren't particularly massive for the weight, being successful at lighter weight divisions, but now they're probably performing a lot better when they're going up in weight categories. They're not necessarily like big and long for the weight and cramming down into that weight category. They've still got element of needing to make weight and to do a weight cut, but it's not that extreme where you're taking a lot out of a fighter just to try and get a height and size advantage. I think that it's better to get an athlete fueled and strong and in a safe position to go into fights. So yeah, definitely just not thinking, can I get an athlete to this weight category? Trying to restrict them as much as possible to try and make them as big as possible for the weight, or trying to find a weight, the necessary weight that they can perform at the best. I think that is the way forward in professional boxing. You're seeing it a lot more. Like I said, them three big names in professional boxing, they're not absolutely massive for the weight, but they're performing at 2 or 3 weight divisions higher than what they were doing before. Another example is Terence Crawford as well. Terence Crawford started at lightweight, now he's up at welterweight, and this is where we're seeing his best performances. 3 biggest mistakes for professional boxers: managing time between camps and making sure that you're not having too long off, managing training load at the start, middle and end of training camp, and also making sure that you're not weight cutting drastically and finding the right weight for you to perform at, not the weight that you can achieve to be as big as possible at. Okay, so I've got a good question from Coach Matt. How do you go about programming sprint training sessions during a week that you're also doing heavy lifting? I'm trying to figure out how to maximize intensity whilst preventing excessive soreness throughout the week. This is something that we get asked quite often at Boxing Science, and something that a lot of people struggle with in terms of training distribution. First thing that we do with an athlete when they come in is find out what they're doing in their boxing training, when their most intense days are, what kind of commitments that they have, and then we try and work around it. So it's very individualized, but the general rule of thumb is to make sure that you're separating conditioning sessions out across the week, separating your hard days by a recovery day or a rest day. So you're making sure that you're not having 3 or 4 hard days on the trot. We make sure that our athletes are having 2 hard days, boxing and strength, boxing and conditioning, and then that third day is a lower day. Some of the boxing coaches that we work with actually do a lower kind of intensive boxing session where they'll do pads, they'll work more on technique work rather than like doing intense sparring or intense conditioning session, and then they'll do their recovery session on that day as well. And then we mirror that towards the back end of the week where we'll do strength and conditioning on separate days again, and then they're likely to do 1 session over the weekend in terms of conditioning. So we're making sure that an athlete isn't doing 2 hard days back to back, basically getting that recovery day in the middle to make sure we're bringing down that training load and improving kind of their day-to-day wellness. So I've got a great question from Francesco De Leo. Is there any need to set progressions for the mobility exercises you incorporate in your warm-ups? Okay, so this is a great question. We perform the same mobility routine once or twice a day for strength sessions, for conditioning sessions, and also for boxing sessions. And this is a Boxing Science mobility warm-up. If you're new to the YouTube channel, go and check this out, where we focus on our key mobility routine. We give this away free, and also you can access the person as well. With this routine, the reason why we do it is because it works on 4 key areas for boxing: rotational mobility, shoulder mobility, hip mobility, and glute strength. There's not much need to do any more than these exercises because we're working them 4 key areas that a boxer needs to work on. During training camp, we do put in some extra mobility exercises, whether that's to prepare for key lift. So for example, for squatting, work on hip mobility to make sure that the hips are loose and a boxer can get into a nice deep squat position comfortably and effectively. And also like for trap bar deadlifts and deadlift variations, we're likely to do something around the posterior shoulder to just activate the posterior shoulders, because this is vital for postural stability and postural strength during key compound lifts. We also look at an athlete's strengths and areas for improvement and mobility restrictions, and also look at their injury history as well to make sure that we're doing something specific for them. So we might add in extra shoulder exercises or extra rotational mobility. As we get closer towards fight night, we'll add in some extra mobility drills because we're reducing the amount of kind of training load, and we want our athletes to be loose and fresh and ready to go. We incorporate extra mobility exercises within the workout rather than it being like an extended warm-up or an extension of the mobility warm-up. And also we put in some extra mobility exercises for those that are needing it around like any kind of niggles or pains that they have that are likely to pick up during training camp. So I've got a question from Clay Cox, an interesting one. What are the two biggest bang for your buck exercises for punch speed and power? I'd be looking more general in terms of like training camp. So if I could only pick two exercises for the biggest bang of your buck, trap bar deadlift, because I know that we can do different variations of that. We can work towards maximum strength. We can do partial ranges. And also we can like reducing that intensity, looking for strength, speed and speed adaptations from that. So the second biggest bang for your buck exercise would be isometric pull-off press and working rotational strength. So the reason why for this is because in recent research that we're doing down at Boxing Science, this is not published at the moment, but very, very early data collection, that we're seeing a big correlation with the amount of force that they're able to produce in an isometric pull-off press, correlations with landmine punch throw peak velocity. And we're seeing like a much bigger relationship in this test than we would do with the jumping test. So a lot of our data and our training has been towards being able to jump higher. The higher that you can jump, the harder that you can punch. This is between a 40 and 60% correlation, whereas rotational test is looking at anywhere between 60 and 80%, and a much bigger transfer towards a punch. So if I could only choose two exercises, I'd be looking at improving lower body impulse. So now that I can do this with a trap bar deadlift, and then rotational strength as well, because we know from the data that this is having the biggest correlation, biggest crossover. So it'd be like different variations of the pull-off press, whether that's isometric maximum tension, 3 seconds, doing some feedback on the cables and with the crane scales, or doing a longer version, somewhere between 5 or 10 seconds. A question from Iron Fist, great name. If you had to pick 3 traditional boxing specific training workouts, such as the heavy bag, to be the main focus of your workouts, which would they be? Thanks in advance. Pretty hard for me to answer because I'm not a boxing coach, even though I've been around the boxing gym, I've got my qualifications, but see myself as a strength conditioning coach and sports scientist rather than a boxing coach. Being around the boxing gym and being around elite professional boxers is that sparring is your main thing go towards and prioritize within a training camp. So when an athlete goes through peak sparring phases, I'm making sure that the conditioning drills and the strength drills that we're doing down here at Boxing Science are looking at that minimum effective dose, get the least amount of work for the targeted adaptation to make sure that we're not being sore or fatigued going to that sparring. Really recognize the importance of sparring, and not only to get that technique and timing, but also to replicate the demands of the sport, replicate what it's like to be in competition in a fight. Boxing has probably the largest training to competition ratio. Football, for example, they train all the way through the week. They might play once or even twice a week. Whereas like boxers training for 10 or 12 weeks, then they have competition at the end. So it's a massive, massive ratio towards training. So you've got to try and replicate that match fitness and competition fitness as much as you can in boxing. So that's why I say, like, in terms of sparring, you've just got to try and replicate the intensity and volume demands exactly like it would be in a fight. So that's number one. Sparring's always number one. Number two would be pads. Pads are important to get that technique and timing and fitness. The reason why this is so important is because you're working on defense as well. So not just on the heavy bag, just throwing punches, not thinking about what's coming back. It's really important for the coach to create some sort of defensive scenario for you to move your head, move your feet, move your trunk, pivot and change the angles and everything like that. So that's the reason why I pick pads over working on the heavy bag. Lastly, it's not like anything to do with bags. It's more like shadow boxing, thinking about what you're doing, placing your hands, working on technique and timing, working under not as much load and impact forces. You can increase the volume on this, and also you can increase the intensity in terms of your punch output as well. I've said this on like videos with Inoue and with Usyk, where they're doing like really intense bursts, really increasing that intensity in terms of how many punches thrown per second. You're not going to get much spikes in intensity on the bags, pads, and also in sparring as well. Take everything away in terms of like hitting a target and also taking away the weight of the gloves. You're going to get much higher spikes in intensity during shadow boxing as well. So not only for training the mind and also training technique and your timing, but also training your fitness as well. Cornell XX1 has asked how to prevent lead shoulder fatigue. So this is something that we get quite a lot of boxing science, talking about shoulder endurance, especially the lead hand. Now, the reason why the lead hand gets more fatigued than the rear hand is mostly down to being quite tight in terms of a defensive position. When they throw, it's more of an arm shot rather than rotating into it. And also, you get a large ratio of lead hand to backhand. You think about some of the combinations, double jab, backhand, that's a 2-to-1 ratio. Double jab, backhand, left hook is a 3-to-1 ratio. And then if you just think about single jabs and single lead hooks, that ratio is increasing. So that's probably why you're getting more fatigue in that lead hand than the backhand. And also you're probably looking at shoulder tightness in this lead hand as well. You're having different muscles compensating, more anterior base, compensating because of weakness in the rear shoulder. So with all this activity, you're using it a lot more, so you're going to end up being more fatigued. But also because you're using a lot more, it becomes more overactive, and you're creating tightness and imbalances as well. Creating more anterior dominance because you're tight in this lead shoulder. They're going to be weaker in your posterior shoulders, which means that this anterior shoulder is working more, being overworked and feeling more fatigued. So the key things that we need to do is loosen off this shoulder, try and mobilize it. Then we need to look to stabilize the shoulder and strengthen it through controlled vertical pressing exercises, such as the landmine press or the kneeling single arm press, and definitely look to stabilize the shoulder by doing the kettlebell bottoms up press. Then also look to increase the strength and activation of the posterior shoulder, so doing stuff like band pull aparts, T-raises, prone reverse flies, to make sure that you're strengthening the posterior shoulders, because the stronger the posterior shoulders are, the more it's going to be activated during your boxing, and the less kind of demand is made on the anterior shoulder as well. If you're wanting more exercise examples and want me to go a little bit more in depth, go and check out our YouTube video on this, talking about the different exercises that you can use to help lead shoulder mobility. That is shoulder exercises for boxing, improve lead hand shoulder mobility. The link's in the description as well if you want to go and check that out. A question from Instagram: how to manage shin splints during fight camp. So if you're feeling like you've got shin splints and having this pain across your shin, it's more likely to be pain in the tibialis anterior. So this is a muscle that just runs on the side of your shin. And this can often be tight and inflamed due to poor ankle mobility, and also tightness in the plantar fasciitis, which is sitting at the bottom of your foot, and also tightness in the calves because you're quite overactive in your calves in terms of running and also during boxing activity. So there's a few different things that you can do. You can increase the range of motion of your ankles to take away kind of that demand from the tibialis anterior. Look to release the plantar fasciitis, which is at the bottom of your foot. So rolling your foot on a massage ball, then also releasing the calf muscles as well. So looking to do like massage gun or massage ball onto the calves. So these are great to kind of release that pain, but what is actually happening in your boxing training? You've got to look at your running loads and where you're running So a lot of people experience shin splints when doing long road runs, especially at low intensities, because as you are doing lower intensity running, it will increase the demand on the calves get tight, and then this will affect the tibialis anterior pain. So be looking to do like kind of shorter, more intense intervals, maybe running at high speeds. And also you can help reduce it by using different treadmills. So doing an incline on a normal motorized treadmill or doing your conditioning on the curve. So if you're doing these things, making adaptations to your conditioning training and also doing the rehab tools as well, you might want to look at how you're distributing your running across the week, how many times you're running, kind of doing running sessions back to back. You want to make sure that you're getting that distribution right and also the frequency right. So we only do 3 high intensity sessions a week at Boxing Science, and we do an off feet kind of recovery session. If an athlete is struggling with shin splints, we might look to do an off feet conditioning session for the high intensity session. So might use an air bike instead, or watt bike, or might be looking to replace that with circuits just to try and reduce that running volume, help prevent any kind of tibialis anterior like soreness and inflammation, but any kind of lower limb injuries. We'd look to try and reduce that running load by altering the volume and intensity, but also reducing the amount of running sessions that we do, replacing a running session with an off-feet conditioning session, such as using the exercise bike, air bike, or using a circuit. So that's the end of this week's episode of the Boxing Science Podcast. Thank you very much for watching or listening. Whatever platform that you're on, please hit the like button, give us a rating, because this will really help the growth of the channel. And also, if you're not a subscriber yet, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Hopefully the questions that I've answered today has helped you in your specific situations, whether you're a coach or an athlete or just looking to get fitter and stronger. If you've got any questions to feature in the next episode of the Boxing Science Podcast, please leave them in the comment box below. Thank you very much for listening or watching. Hopefully see you on the next episode.